Welcome to Sleepy Historian, where history drifts through the quiet of night, stories of the past told softly to calm your mind and guide you to rest. The sea is calm tonight. The water was always quiet. If you stood by the shore long enough, you could almost hear the echoes beneath it, faint, ghost-like, like the murmur of old voices carried through time. At dawn, when the mist curled over the surface, it looked less like a lake and more like a sleeping memory, still patient and ancient. The people who lived nearby called it Hollow Lake, though long ago it had another name, a name that was spoken softly, almost forgotten now, like a word you remember from a dream but can't quite recall when you wake. There was a time, not so long ago, when there was no lake at all. Just a valley, quiet and green, a small American town nestled among the hills, a place where the smell of pine drifted through open windows and Sunday bells echoed across meadows. That town had a name too, Elden Hollow. Elden Hollow was never famous. It wasn't the kind of place that appeared on maps in bold letters or drew travelers from far away. It was small, the kind of town that lived quietly and disappeared slowly. By the late 1800s, it had one narrow main street lined with white wooden shops, a little schoolhouse with a creaky porch, and a single church steeple that caught the morning sun. The railroad had passed it by, the factories never came, and the people who lived there didn't seem to mind. In Elden Hollow, time moved differently. Children played near the brook that wound behind the mill. Farmers talked about weather more than politics. And in the evenings, families sat on their porches and listened to the frogs begin their songs in the distance. No one ever imagined the valley would one day vanish beneath the water. The first whispers came in 1911. Strangers in dark suits arrived, engineers, men with maps and clipboards. They said the government planned to build a reservoir, a lake that would supply water to the growing city miles away. The valley, they said, was perfect for it. People in Elden Hollow listened in silence. They didn't quite understand what it meant. The strangers spoke in calm, practical tones about progress, about the future. But to the people who had lived their whole lives there, it sounded like something else entirely, an ending disguised as improvement. That winter, surveyors began to hammer stakes into the frozen ground. Mrs. Holloway, who ran the post office, said the sound of the hammers was like a heartbeat, slow, steady, and sad. At night, when the moonlight touched the half-frozen river, she'd stand by her window and whisper to her husband, "They're measuring our days, Daniel, one stake at a time." And perhaps in a way, she was right. The following spring, letters began arriving, official ones printed on pale paper and stamped with a seal. Each letter carried the same message in careful government language: the property within the valley will be purchased for public use. Some resisted, others sighed, signed, and packed. But even as they left, many stayed as long as they could, lingering through one last summer, one more harvest, one final Sunday in the church where their parents had prayed. By 1914, Elden Hollow stood almost empty. The old mill creaked in the wind, windows boarded, doors chained. Wildflowers grew along the empty road, pushing through cracks where wagon wheels once rolled. Then came the flood. The dam was built upstream, a wall of stone and steel that rose slowly, like a monument to progress. When the gates closed, the water began to rise. Inch by inch it filled the hollow, swallowing meadows, barns, and homes. By autumn, only the church steeple remained visible, a white spire against the grey reflection of the sky. Then one morning, it too disappeared. For a while, people would row boats over the new lake and point to the place where the town had once been. They said on clear days you could still see the tops of chimneys below the surface, like ghosts frozen in blue glass. And sometimes when the wind was still, you could hear faint sounds rising from the water. The echo of a bell, or the creak of a wagon wheel, or maybe just the imagination of those who remembered too much. Now, all that remains is the lake, wide, silent, beautiful in a haunting sort of way. Visitors come and go, unaware that beneath their reflections lies a forgotten town, an entire world waiting in the dark, where time has stopped and stories still sleep. And sometimes, when the moon is high and the air is still, the surface of Hollow Lake ripples as if something beneath has stirred, as if the past for just a moment remembers itself. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales from the quiet corners of history. We'll see you next time. All that remains is the lake, wide, silent, beautiful in a haunting sort of way. Visitors come and go, unaware that beneath their reflections lies a forgotten town, an entire world waiting in the dark where time has stopped and stories still sleep. And sometimes when the moon is high and the air is still, the surface of Hollow Lake ripples, as if something beneath has stirred, as if the past, for just a moment, remembers itself. The last summer came quietly. No one called it that, of course, not then. But in the memories that remained, that's what people would come to call it. The summer before the water came. The air was warm and heavy with the scent of wild clover. The fields shimmered under long days of golden light. The hollow seemed to breathe in rhythm with the wind, as if it knew what was coming and was trying to remember everything before it slipped away. It was June 1913. The mornings began with birdsong over the valley. Dew clung to fence posts, and the sound of a distant hammer echoed faintly from the men working on the dam miles upstream. At the edge of town, a young farmer named Thomas Merrin stood by the brook and watched the water run clear over smooth stones. He'd grown up in Elden Hollow, same as his father before him. He knew every turn of the creek, every shade of the fields. His land had been in the family for generations, a patch of earth small enough to plow with one horse, big enough to feel like forever. When the government letter arrived, offering money for the property, Thomas read it twice and set it aside. He didn't need to think about it. He wasn't selling, not yet. Each afternoon, the townsfolk carried on as though life would simply continue. Children still chased each other through the tall grass, their laughter mixing with the hum of cicadas. Mrs. Holloway still opened the post office each morning, though fewer and fewer letters came. On Sundays, the church bell still rang. Its sound drifted through the air, deep, warm, and slow, like a heartbeat steadying itself against time. Somewhere, deep down, everyone knew the truth, but no one wanted to say it aloud. One evening, near midsummer, the townspeople gathered in the square for what they called the Hollow Fair. It had been a tradition for decades, a day of music, small games, and home-cooked pies laid out on long wooden tables. This year, it felt different. There was laughter, but it carried a kind of softness, the kind people use when they're trying not to cry. Children raced wooden boats in the creek, unaware that soon the same water would rise high enough to cover their little feet, their homes, their school. An old fiddler played by lantern light as the sun slipped behind the hills. Couples danced slowly, the dust swirling around their boots, glowing gold in the fading light. When the music ended, there was a long silence, a stillness that stretched across the crowd. Someone said softly, "This might be the last one." No one answered, but everyone knew. As summer deepened, more wagons left the valley. The hollow began to empty, one family then another. Windows were boarded, gardens left untended. Each night, the sound of the river grew louder, as if it was slowly claiming its inheritance. Thomas stayed. He told himself he would remain until the very end, until the first trickle of floodwater touched his boots. He wasn't stubborn out of pride, but because every memory he had was rooted in that soil. His father had built the farmhouse by hand. His mother's laughter still seemed to linger in the walls. To leave was to unmake everything that had ever been real. By August, the nights grew still. The air felt heavier, and the glow of the dam's lanterns shimmered on the northern ridge. The reservoir was nearly complete. One night, as Thomas walked through the empty main street, he passed the schoolhouse. Moonlight fell through the open door, illuminating the chalkboard still marked with faint lessons. Arithmetic, history, spelling. Dust hung in the air like slow snow. He walked on, past the general store with its windows boarded, past the church where the bell rope had been cut and coiled neatly beside the pew. The silence was immense. It was as though the valley itself had paused, holding its breath, waiting. On the last Sunday before autumn, the remaining townsfolk gathered one final time at the church. Only 15 people came. The pews creaked softly as they sat. Outside, the wind brushed against the open door, carrying the faint scent of pine and the distant hum of the dam. Pastor Weller stood at the front holding a Bible worn from years of hands. He looked at the faces before him, people he had married, baptized, buried. He cleared his throat, then spoke in a quiet voice. "Some say the Lord's work is in what we build," he said, "but sometimes it's in what we let go." When the final hymn ended, no one moved to leave. They simply sat in the fading light, listening to the stillness. That night, Thomas climbed the ridge behind his farm. From there, he could see the whole valley spread out, silver in the moonlight, peaceful and unreal. He tried to imagine what it would look like underwater, the barns, the roads, the steeple, all slowly vanishing into silence. And for the first time, he didn't feel angry, only quiet, a strange kind of peace. He whispered into the wind, "If the valley must sleep, let it dream." Below in the distance, the faint glimmer of the dam lights flickered like stars reflected in the water. Soon they would open the gates. The last summer of Elden Hollow was ending, and the world was preparing to forget. The water came quietly, not as a roar or a storm, but with the slow patience of something ancient, something inevitable. It began on a grey morning in early September. Mist clung to the valley, thick and low, blurring the outlines of the hills. By noon, the brook that had once babbled softly through Elden Hollow had changed its voice. It no longer whispered, it hummed, steady and deep. By evening, the lowlands glimmered with thin sheets of silver. From the ridge, Thomas Merrin watched the valley transform. It wasn't sudden, and that made it harder. There was time to see every fence post swallowed, every blade of grass sink beneath the rippling surface. By the second day, the mill was gone. By the third, the churchyard fence was half submerged, the tops of its white posts reflecting like candles in the dusk. Each night the sound of rushing water grew louder, echoing off the hills, a deep, endless murmur like breathing. On the fourth morning, the church bell rang once, and only once. No one had touched it. The sound drifted across the valley, soft and distant, as if the lake itself had exhaled a memory. By noon, the steeple began to vanish. Thomas watched as its reflection shivered, folded, and disappeared into the growing mirror of the water. When the last tip of the roof slipped below the surface, he whispered, "Good night, Hollow." By the end of the week, the valley was gone. Where there had once been homes and laughter, there was now only stillness, a vast shimmering plain stretching from hill to hill. The lake was beautiful, terrible in its beauty, too perfect, too calm. It reflected everything above and revealed nothing beneath. That night the first rain fell. Gentle, persistent, it blurred the line between sky and water. Thomas thought of his father, who used to say, "Land remembers its people." But now, as the rain fell softly around him, Thomas wondered, would the water remember too? Or would it smooth it all away until nothing remained but quiet? He stared out across the dark, glassy expanse and listened. And for a moment, he thought he heard something rising from the depths below. The faint toll of a bell, slow and distant, drifting through the mist. The next morning, the sun returned. The lake gleamed under a pale blue sky. The townsfolk who had moved away began to return, one by one, to stand by the shore. Some tossed flowers into the water. Some simply stood in silence. By afternoon, only Thomas remained. He took a step toward the edge, letting the cold water touch his boots. The surface rippled gently, carrying his reflection outward until it broke apart and disappeared. Elden Hollow was gone, but not lost. It had simply changed its shape, from town to memory, from soil to silence. Years passed. The world moved on. By the 1930s, most people no longer remembered the name Elden Hollow. It had become just another part of the landscape, a wide, quiet reservoir. But for those who knew, the beauty carried a quiet sadness, a memory that rippled just beneath the surface. On certain nights, locals spoke of hearing faint bells, not from the church on the hill, but from somewhere deep below the water. Others said they saw shapes under the surface, a rooftop, a fence post, the faint shadow of a road leading to nowhere. Of course, no one ever proved it. But in towns nearby, the old folks would lower their voices and say, "The Hollow remembers." By the 1950s, A small lakeside cabin stood near the eastern ridge, built by a retired schoolteacher named Evelyn Marsh. She came seeking quiet. But at night she sometimes woke to a low echo deep and far away. It sounded almost like voices, soft, overlapping murmurs, too faint to understand, yet too human to ignore. One autumn evening, she rowed her small boat to the center of the lake. The water was glass smooth, and then she heard it again. The faintest sound, like a church bell heard through fog. One, then another. The sound didn't seem to come from the air, but from below. She whispered softly, "Hello?" And somewhere far beneath, it felt as if something stirred, a ripple gentle but certain touching the side of her boat and vanishing again. Evelyn began to write. She filled a notebook with sketches and stories about the drowned town. When neighbors asked why she stayed alone, she would smile and say, "Because the lake dreams and I like to listen." When she passed away, her notebook was found on the porch table. The final page was unfinished, with just a few words. "The water keeps its memories. You only have to be still long enough to hear them." The century turned, and the lake, unchanging, unmoved, stayed exactly where it was. By the 21st century, few people knew the full story anymore. Most who visited the lake came for the peace. But every now and then, someone would feel it, that quiet, unexplainable pull. A sense that there was more here than trees and water. One of those people was a local historian named Henry Clark. He'd grown up hearing stories from his grandmother about the valley that sleeps beneath the water. As a boy, he had laughed. As a man, he began to wonder. Henry arrived one spring morning and walked down to the water's edge. The air was still. A soft breeze rippled across the surface. He sat on a fallen log, opened his notebook, and began to write. Not facts, not dates, but impressions. How the light moved across the lake, how the water seemed to hold its breath between ripples, how every sound felt muted, as though the air itself were listening. As the day passed, Henry explored the shore, tracing faint lines in the soil where old roads might have once run. He found stones, smooth, round, some with edges too deliberate to be natural. He found rusted nails, pieces of old pottery, and once, half buried in mud, the curved rim of a porcelain cup. He brushed the dirt away gently, turning it over in his hand. The glaze was cracked, faintly blue, delicate, old, human. He smiled softly, then set it back down where he'd found it. Some things, he thought, were better left where they belonged. As evening fell, the light over the lake turned golden. The surface shimmered like melted glass. Henry sat quietly, watching it shift, and thought of the people who had once lived here. Their voices, their small hopes, their quiet goodbyes. He could almost see them. The flicker of lanterns in windows that no longer existed, the faint smoke of chimneys rising through water. Not ghosts, not spirits, no. Just memories still alive in the deep, like the last echoes of a song. As twilight deepened, a thin mist began to form over the water. It curled in slow spirals, pale and silver, moving like breath. Henry watched in silence, notebook forgotten in his lap. Then, faintly, so faintly he thought at first it was the wind, came the sound of something distant, a low, resonant tone. One single chime. He froze, listening. Then another. And another. Soft, slow, impossibly far away, but unmistakable. A bell. Henry stood and stepped closer to the water's edge. The ripples spread outward, catching the fading light of the sky. He whispered, almost without meaning to, "Elden Hollow." The sound of his voice was carried across the lake, gentle and weightless. When it faded, the air seemed to hold its breath again. Then, silence. Perfect. Infinite silence. He stayed there until the stars appeared, bright, countless, reflected in the dark water like tiny lanterns. When he finally turned to leave, the moon rose over the ridge behind him. It was full, pale, and still. Its reflection shimmered on the lake's surface, and for just a heartbeat, Henry thought he saw something beneath it. The faint outline of a steeple. A rooftop. A glimmer of white wood deep below, untouched by time. Then the wind shifted, and the water smoothed over once more. Later that night, Henry wrote in his journal, "The lake remembers. It holds what we forget. Beneath the water, the past sleeps. Not gone, not lost. Just resting." He closed the book and looked out through his cabin window one last time before sleep. The lake lay still beneath the moonlight, vast and peaceful like the surface of a dream. And in that silence, in that infinite calm, he finally understood what his grandmother had meant. The valley wasn't gone. It was still here. In the quiet, in the stillness, in the memory that lives between the waves. The night deepened. Stars hung above the still water like tiny sparks frozen in time. No wind stirred the trees. Only the quiet rhythm of the lake remained, the slow rise and fall as if the earth itself were breathing. Henry had fallen asleep by the window. The candle on his desk had long since burned down to its final pool of wax. Outside, the moonlight drifted across the surface of Hollow Lake, turning it silver and soft, almost alive. And in that silver calm beneath the surface, the past began to stir. No one would ever see it, not clearly. The water was too deep, too dark. But if you could sink beneath it, gently, slowly, you might see what the world forgot. The faint outline of an old road. The curved stone wall of a garden still half standing. Iron gates covered in moss. And at the very heart of it, the small white steeple of a church, rising from the silt like a memory that refused to fade. The windows were gone, but the shape remained. Fish moved silently through open doors. Roots from the forest above had reached down into the old rooms, threading themselves through beams and pews, pulling the town gently back into the earth. The houses still stood, softened, ghostly. Their walls blurred by decades of water and time. They leaned against one another like tired souls resting together in sleep. There were no people now, no voices, no sound. And yet somehow, the place still felt awake. Not haunted, never that. Just remembering. When moonlight touched the water at the right angle, faint shapes shimmered beneath it. Doorframes, fences, maybe even a roof. To most eyes, they were tricks of light. But to those who listened, truly listened, there was something else. A kind of hum, low and endless, like the sound of breath between heartbeats, the sound of history dreaming. Long ago, when the town was still alive, the people of Elden Hollow had lived simple lives. They built, they loved, they worried, they hoped. And when the flood came, they thought their story had ended. But it hadn't. It had only sunk. And in sinking, it had found peace. Now beneath the calm, the town slept on, held in the arms of the lake. Wood turned to stone, paths turned to sand, but the feeling remained. A warmth, a memory, a whisper that said, "We were here, we lived, we mattered." Have you ever stood by the edge of a large, still body of water at night and felt a strange sense of history? A feeling that the darkness below holds more than just water and rock? Tonight, we're going to drift into one such story, a tale whispered by the wind across a forgotten lake. A story of a place called Elden Hollow. Imagine a valley, nestled between gentle rolling hills where a small town once thrived. A place with a name that sounds like a half-remembered song, Elden Hollow. It wasn't a place you'd find on any modern map. Its streets were paved with stories, its homes built with the timber of the surrounding forests, and its heart was a community that knew the rhythm of the seasons like their own pulse. They had a small white church with a bell that rang out over the fields, a single general store where neighbors exchanged news as much as goods, and homes where the scent of wood smoke and baking bread filled the air. Life was simple, predictable, and deeply rooted in the land. Then came the project. Progress, they called it. A dam was needed to bring power and water to the growing cities far away. The valley of Elden Hollow, with its natural basin shape, was the perfect location. The news arrived not as a dramatic thunderclap, but as a slow, creeping inevitability. First came the surveyors with their tripods and measuring tapes, then the official notices tacked onto the door of the town hall. The town that had stood for generations was given an expiration date. Its fate was to be submerged, erased from the landscape, to serve a world that barely knew it existed. You can imagine the conversations that took place over kitchen tables and on front porches. The sorrow, the anger, the quiet resignation. Families had to pack up lifetimes of memories into boxes and crates. They had to say goodbye to the homes their grandparents had built, the gardens their mothers had tended, the ancient oak tree where they'd carved their initials as children. Each closing door echoed with a finality that was heartbreaking. The last service was held in the church, the bell tolling not for a wedding or a funeral, but for the town itself. One by one, the lights of Elden Hollow went out for the last time. Then the water began to rise. Slowly, silently, it crept up the fields, swallowing the dirt roads first, then lapping at the foundations of the empty houses. It climbed the walls, filled the rooms where families had once gathered, and poured through the broken panes of the church windows. The water didn't crash or destroy. It simply claimed everything, covering it in a placid blue shroud. The spire of the church was the last thing to disappear, a final, lonely finger pointing to the sky before it too was gone. Where a town once stood, there was now only a vast, deep lake. The world above moved on. The dam was celebrated as a marvel of engineering. But beneath the surface, Elden Hollow didn't vanish. It was preserved. Years turned into decades. The new lake became a popular spot for fishing and boating. People came for the peaceful scenery, unaware of the silent community sleeping below. But some nights, when the air is still and the moon is low, something strange happens. The lake seems to glow with a faint ethereal light from within. Fishermen see it and rationalize it away, saying it's just the reflection of the stars or a trick of the moonlight on the water. But the old locals, the descendants of those who once lived in the valley, they know better. The few who still remember the name Elden Hollow will lean in and tell you it's not the stars you're seeing. They say it's the town itself, shining softly from the deep. It's as if the lamps were still burning in their windows, as if the people never truly left. And maybe, in some quiet, watery way, they never did. Because water doesn't just erase. It holds things. It remembers. Think about it. The water that now fills the valley holds everything that once was. It cradles the laughter of children playing in the town square, the sorrow of a family's last goodbye, the sound of music drifting from a Saturday night dance, the gentle patter of rain on a tin roof. All the small, insignificant, beautiful things that once made up a life. They aren't gone. They just drift now in an endless, slow-motion ballet, like fragments of dreams that you can't quite shake upon waking. If you ever find yourself by the shore of such a lake, stay a while after the sun has set. When the world grows quiet, and the only sound is the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, listen. Listen with more than just your ears. You might begin to hear it. A phantom sound, a door closing softly somewhere in the deep, the faint resonant echo of a church bell tolling across the years, the sudden clear peal of a child's laughter that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. These aren't ghosts in the way we think of them. They aren't warnings or restless spirits. They are just the gentle sounds of memory. It is the past, breathing softly beneath the surface. The lake has become a vessel, a liquid time capsule, holding a whole world in its silent embrace. The town is no longer a place of wood and stone, but an echo, a feeling suspended in time. And when the morning comes, a thick mist often rises from the water, blanketing the surface like a soft quilt. As the sun climbs higher, the mist burns away, and the lake sparkles once more, clear and bright. It returns to being just a lake. Only ripples, only sky, only a profound sense of peace. The world above continues its busy, noisy existence, but deep below Elden Hollow sleeps on, untouched and eternal, a whole history resting underwater, held not in dusty books or crumbling monuments, but in the profound living silence of the deep. And it is in that silence in that deep, quiet water that stories like this one live. They wait patiently for someone to come along, to sit by the shore and to be still enough to listen. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the past. If you enjoy stories that drift between history and mystery, consider subscribing and joining our community of curious minds. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with wonder.